With adult hindsight, what was a complete what-in-the-world moment for your childhood that you didn't understand at the time? When I was a child and my sister was a teenager, she came home from a sleepover with a large red welt in her neck. When my mother questioned her about it, she wove an epic tale of a fight amongst friends, culminating in the use of Tootsie Rolls as projectiles. Though she had remained neutral, she was sadly struck in the neck during the event. My mom apparently decided to see how far my sister was willing to take this story. She feigned indignation and said she wanted the phone numbers for the girl that threw the Tootsie Roll and the girl that hosted the party, to inform their mothers of the incident. There was talk of removing those friends out of my sister's life. At the time, I was horrified that had happened to her. Years later, I realized my mother decided to troll instead of addressing the fact that her daughter came home from a girls-only supervised sleepover with a hickey. Guess someone took a dare in that sleepover. Story 2. When I was a child, we had a lice check at school, and it turned out I had lice. I was sent home and quarantined. All of my bedding and stuffed animals were thrown away, and I couldn't be around anyone. Every morning and night, my mother had to use tweezers to pull them and their eggs out of my eyebrows and eyelashes. After about a week of this, a stranger showed up at my house and took me into the living room alone. She showed me a girl and boy doll and started asking me really weird questions. I was 100% confused. Turns out I had crabs. Since they typically live in hairs down there and I didn't have any, they decided to live in my eyelashes. My mom thought I'd been mistreated. In reality, the babysitter had been intimate with her boyfriend on a couch at a different house that I then took a nap on. I want to add that I didn't know the truth until I was about 25. My niece got lice and I was surprised they weren't in her eyelashes. My mother told me what had really happened and I'm still mortified. Story 3. So, when I was little, our town was struck by a tornado. It was the only cloud in the sky and it took seemingly forever to get through town. My grandparents came and got us. Mom, me, little sis, and my little cousin, and we drove out of town away from the storm. I had a teacher tell me I was lying about this, but this tornado was unusually slow. It is on record as being unusually slow. My grandpa didn't want us kids to even hear the storm, let alone be caught in it. We watched it from a nearby safe location, and I still remember feeling my heart stop when a landmark near our house disappeared in the storm. My dad hadn't made it home from work before we left. We were waiting for him until we couldn't wait any longer. My mom and sister and I cried all the way home, thinking my dad was gone. When we pulled up to the house and it was still there, my dad came running out. Honestly, it was the best feeling ever, followed by the second best feeling to a child when my best friend and her family came running through the backyard, safe as well. My great-grandpa wasn't so lucky, but in those first few minutes, it seemed everything would be okay. Anyway, this was the actual what-in-the-world moment. My dad was still at work, mechanic and tow truck driver and a volunteer fireman. When it started and he booked it home and proceeded to take a shower in the basement bathroom. For years, we gave him scoldings about taking a shower during a tornado, then watching the tornado with a towel wrapped around his waist. We couldn't understand why he took a shower instead of taking cover. It became one of those stories we told whenever the topic of the tornado came up. Did you know my dad watched the whole thing with a towel around his waist? Finally, many years later, on the anniversary of this tornado, we were sitting around the table and the subject came up again. Remember, we had been teasing him about this for 20 years. You want to know why I was taking a shower? I'll tell you why. You don't remember this because the tornado happened and everyone forgot everything else. This kid, Bob so-and-so, was running late on the way to his wedding. And he got struck by a semi at the corner of XXX and Highway X. He didn't make it. I was taking a shower because I was covered in fuel. I knew the water could be shut off after the tornado, and if I didn't get that off, I would be stuck with that smell in my hair and on my skin. That's why I took a shower in the middle of a tornado. And I was watching it in my towel because I was washing a bit, running up to see how much time I had and running back to the shower to rinse. All of a sudden, we realized what a bunch of schmucks we'd been for 20 years. I never teased him a bit about that again. Hadn't even told my mom because things were crazy immediately, due to my great-grandpa being severely injured, 2 family members losing houses, and the whole town being a disaster zone. My dad never talked much about the bad stuff he saw as a volunteer fireman or a tow truck driver when we were growing up. He wasn't one to brag. Just do the job, do it well, and move on. As he gets older, he's been sharing more details. It's fascinating and heartbreaking to know what he's been through, and that he carried all this alone for so long. He's gone into burning houses to find friends. Failed because the guy had gone crazy and was in town burning down his bar too. Fell through the floor of the funeral home when it burned and was only saved by his air pack and instinctively sticking his elbows out, catching himself. He made his fellow firefighters swear to never tell my mom about that one. So, of course, they told everyone at his retirement party. He's seen what happens to people who drink and drive or ride motorcycles without helmets or protective gear. And since he knows pretty much everyone due to his jobs, many times he's known the victims. The worst was when my sister's best friend's mom decided to drive herself and her two young sons off a bridge that had been closed for construction because she didn't want her soon-to-be ex-husband getting custody. My dad never got over that one, because they weren't found until the next morning and my sister's friend passed away from exposure, not the crash. My dad wanted to tell my sister personally, so he went to the school and pulled her out of class after briefly telling the office staff what happened. My dad is full of those moments where he shielded us from the stuff of his jobs. I'm sure I'll hear more as the years go by. I'm not sure I want to know all of what he's done, but man, that guy's one tough SOB. Story 4. So I grew up poor. Really poor. But I was young and never had an indication of how bad things were until this happened. I thought everyone lived like we did. In 3rd grade, I had a pair of boots from Payless that I'd worn for so long it wasn't winter anymore, and the heel had dislodged from the rest of the boot. Only pair of shoes I had that fit. It flopped while I walked, and I often tried to glue it back on with Elmer's at school, or tape it on, which never lasted long. One day I come to class and 2 girls hand me 2 new boxes of shoes, saying they bought them for me. One was a pair of dressy shoes with a buckle, and the other was a pair of pink moccasins with rhinestones in the toe. I was delighted, but didn't think much of it. Not even in the days afterward when some other kids started calling me poor. Funny because almost all of us lived in the same public housing high-rise and food stamp was a common phrase because you could buy snacks with them. So it just goes to show my family was the poorest of the poor. I don't even know if anyone in my family noticed the shoes, but I know my mother never asked me about them. Then again, she was always working or claimed to be working, so I never saw her more than once a day. Many years later, I realized the teacher had bought those shoes and asked the other kids to pretend they had. Thank you, Mrs. Benjamin. Story 5. For my 6th birthday, I had some friends over for a barbecue. We were all being rambunctious little boys, running around the garden, wrestling, rolling around, etc. My dad was setting up the barbecue and somehow managed to burst the lighter fluid bottle and set fire. All we saw was my dad suddenly rolling around in the lawn. At a young age, my only experience with seeing people on fire was from the A-Team, in which nobody ever actually suffered any serious consequences and burning people were just part of the background scenery. We all just figured my dad was getting really into our make-believe games, so we were all just cheering and running around him. He's hard as nails, so when he had managed to smother the fire, he just stood up and said, "Back in a minute, kids," with a big smile on his face and disappeared indoors. My neighbor came over to take care of the barbecue whilst my parents went to the hospital to take care of Dad's burns. We all just continued running around, shouting and wrestling like the little savages. Story 6. This one's fairly depressing. After my parents divorced, my mother had custody of the kids, but my dad would come and pick me and my brothers up on Saturday afternoons for a couple of hours. He would usually go to the comic book store in Pizza Hut or something, and then he'd take us home. My mom had mental problems and was mistreating, so these visits were the highlight of my week. Some weeks my dad just never showed up, and I waited for him as it became more and more obvious he wasn't going to show up, which meant that I wouldn't get pizza and I wouldn't go to the comic book store that week, and my mom would be angry all day because she'd have to stay home and take care of 4 kids unexpectedly. Those were really bad days. One day he came to pick us up and we were out of the house for maybe half an hour, and he pulled his station wagon over to the side of the road and started crying. My brothers and I had no idea what was going on, and we were too afraid to ask. After a little while, he composed himself and in a clear voice stated, "Children, I've wet myself." He told us that he was going to take us back to our house and drop us off with our mother, and then he would go home for the day. I begged him to just go back to his house and change his pants and we could still spend the day together. He wouldn't do it. Not too long after that, he stopped showing up for visits altogether. It's one of my most vivid memories. But as strange as it sounds, I never really questioned why my father whizzed himself that day. I knew that my dad struggled with problems throughout his life, but it was only in the past few years that I put 2 and 2 together and realized that my father was either hammered or drying out that day. Story 7. You guys will barely believe this. When I was young, I was sleeping, when awoken by bright lights coming through my window. Naturally, I freaked out and woke up my pops. He told me to go back to bed while he investigated. The bright lights kept shining through all of the windows, one after the other in no particular order. At the time, I had no idea what this bright light could have been. It was terrifying. I've literally had nightmares that start out the same way since then. Years later, at my father's funeral, my dad's best friend comes over and starts telling the story from another perspective. He tells me, "When we were all younger and I was a cop, I'd fly the police helicopter over to your house and shine the lights on your house to mess with your dad. He'd come outside and moon us." All this time, I had no idea what the bright lights were until then. It all made sense. Our cop friend was using the police helicopter to play with us. I found this out 20 years later. Crazy. I imagine his dad standing in front of the house with a huge spotlight just mooning. This is great. Story 8. When I was young, I remember walking through my house at night, calling for my mom and her not showing up. The next thing I remember is my dad taking me to pick up a lady and her daughter who eventually became my stepmom and stepsister. After a few years, I would be taken back and forth between my parents every few years, but grew to resent my mom for initially abandoning me. She passed away when I was 23 and I flew back home. My sisters and I shared different fathers, and they didn't like mine. I never really understood that since he cared for me so much and was a nice person to everyone. His work even made him have an amazing funeral, and some rich family donated a grave at a nice cemetery. When I asked them why they disliked him so much and why mom abandoned me when I was so young, they finally told me that he would harm her. It all eventually dawned on me that my dad was mistreating. My stepmother had become hurt and angry over the years, and I never put it all together. I think on some subconscious level I knew all this because I'm so scared to hurt people. I'm even scared to be in a relationship because I fear I'll become like him. Story 9. When I was a teenager, my friend and I were near a neighborhood park, building a dirt jump for us to go off with our bikes. This teenage guy, older than us, walks up to us and is rambling on about who knows what. My friend and I, the innocent idiot kids we are, decided it would be funny to hide this guy's bag in the bushes. My friend distracts him and I throw the bag in the bushes. About a minute later, the guy starts freaking out. Like going insane. Screaming words we had never heard. He began frantically and angrily asking us where his bag went. I pointed at my friend, not wanting to take the blame. This guy grabs the shovel we were using to build the jump and starts swinging it as hard as he can, missing him by just a couple inches. We booked it out of there on our bikes and never went back there again. This guy was insane. Looking back now, I know he was completely tweaked. The bag I had was a supply. Story 10. This happened when I was young. I got this good friend at school whom I used to play trading cards with, who had a lot of money out of the blue. He told me he's getting $50 of pocket money every week, a really big deal when we were just kids. He said his godfather was really nice and gave him $50 every week. I was like, hey, I want to meet him too. Seems like a nice guy. His godfather or neighbor will take him out on cruise trips with his family. My friend was like, cool. Let's meet him at 6 p.m. at the playground so we can go to the nearby community center where he can use the toilet. That day, my mom told me not to go out because it was dinner time. Days before, he was telling me things that were inappropriate. Nobody had internet access at the time and we were innocent. I was a bit disgusted when he said that. Many years after that, I realized how fortunate I was that my mom saved me. I could have been a victim. Story 11. When I was a kid, we lived in a street where all the kids would come out and play. We all knew each other and our moms would come out sometimes and check up on us, except the mom of the kid that lived in front of my house. They lived in the corner and their front door was far from the sidewalk, so when she did come out, we couldn't quite see her. The kid was still young and he was in my brother's grade. My brother now says that he and 3 of the other boys go to hang out in their house, and when the kid's mom came out, the kid himself told him that she was his sister. The dad was a photographer and I saw him once at a kid's birthday party doing his job. After about 2 years of living there, one day their house was surrounded by the police and I remember they were bringing out boxes with what looked like paper. I overheard my mom talking to my dad about how he would take pictures of them and how the kid's mom was too young. At the time, I had no idea that my front door neighbor was a criminal. Until many years later, my brother brought it up and things made more sense. Story 12. I was pretty innocent in elementary and middle school, and even though I'm not a perfect angel now, I tend to be the baby of a group that must be protected. Anyways, back then, it was either in late elementary or early middle. My classmates weren't so innocent and the boys were discovering inappropriate jokes. They started making jokes about pickles, saying they hate pickles and would never eat one. My mom always packed me dill pickles for lunch and I thought they were a great snack. Usually people left me alone, but one day I opened my lunch near the boys. Someone asked me, "Hey Marzipansy, do you like pickles?" "I don't." I proceeded to tell them, yes I did. Pickles are great. They should like pickles too. Everyone was snickering and I thought they just really didn't like pickles. I didn't get the joke until much later, and as we got older, it switched to hot dogs. Some kid asked a girl that was pestered a lot if she wanted his hot dog when we were alone in the hall after lunch. She asked if there was anything wrong with it, and he laughed and said it was a perfectly fine hot dog and asked if she wanted to eat it. I told him to shut up and pulled her away before she could answer. I honestly didn't get why the joke was inappropriate. I just knew it was. It wasn't until high school that it got me. Story 13. When I was a kid, my mom's boyfriend's brother, I'll call him Bobby, slept on our couch for a week. I can't remember why. One night while he was there, my best friend was sleeping over. We had big plans to stay up all night playing Nintendo. After my mom and her boyfriend had gone to bed, my friend and I came out to get a snack. Bobby was awake and started talking to us, trying to get us to stay out there and watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show with him, which was just starting on HBO. He was being weirdly insistent and persuasive about it. We just kept saying we wanted to go back and play Nintendo. I remember looking at the TV and being a little freaked out by those big red singing lips. Here's the thing though. The whole time Bobby was talking to us, his thing was out. As an adult man, I realized it's highly unlikely for this to happen without being aware of it. But it was years before I really connected the dots in this guy's agenda. All told, we escaped unharmed. And the worst thing that happened to us that night probably ended up being the hoverbike level on Battletoads. But it could have gone a lot worse. Makes me feel ill to think what that guy had in mind. Story 14. When I was a kid, I had decided to sneak out of the house and go to the shop on my own for some reason, mostly sweets. My house was at the bottom of a large hill, and as I reached the top of the hill to go on the main road, I kid you not, a white van came zooming around a corner and stopped directly in front of me. A bald man in his 30s rolled down his window and asked me directions to a neighborhood that was literally where he must have just come from. I replied it's the way he came and he should turn around. Even as an innocent child, I felt something off about his question. He asks if I want to show him where it is. I reply laughing, but it's just around the corner. He says he has sweets. Just then my dad's car came screeching up to the top of the hill and he shouts for me to get in his car as the white van screeches off back where I came from. Years later, I get chills after realizing what had happened. Story 15. As a kid, my mom used to send me to this old man's house. He lived a few doors down and across the street from us. He wasn't a criminal or anything, and he was nice enough, but he was ancient. He would sit in his armchair and I would sit in his little love seat with a quilt covering it. We would watch game shows or reruns of old TV. I Love Lucy, Bewitched, stuff like that. Or he would tell me stuff about when he was young. He was a pilot. He played baseball as a teenager. He and his wife got married during a mutual friend's birthday weekend because the state they were in would let them marry without our parents signing the license, etc. When I learned to crochet, I took that with me and he would watch me and tell me his Abby could do that, and knit socks too. He asked me to make him a lap blanket for his cold feet, so I did in truly wretched ugly colors as his giant granny square. From the time I gave it to him, he always had it on his lap. I would be at his house 2 or 3 times a week. I kind of wanted to be polite and not to cause a fuss, but I really didn't know why my mom took me there or how she even knew this man. He passed away after, and I remember a ton of his family showed up and were weeping and crying about Grandpa and all, but I had never seen any of them visit him. The funeral was weird because everyone was talking, but no one seemed to be talking about anything special he had done. Even the minister just kind of mentioned he was a veteran and married to his wife Abigail and he had some kids, but no one was talking about any of his stories. And I was just a kid, so I didn't feel right saying anything about it. Years later, I brought up the old man and my uncle was shocked I'd spent time with him. It turns out he and my granddad had been friends in the military during World War II, and his wedding to Abigail in a different state, that was because he was 19 and she was younger and he wanted to marry her in case he goes away overseas. He flew fighter planes, and I was taken to his house because his wife had passed away right before my mom started taking me, and Granddad was concerned he would end himself if left alone too much. But Granddad was 2 counties away and, well, also old. So my mom asked this old man to watch me after school to give him something to do. His kids apparently only came to visit when they wanted money. He made good investments when young, so while he wasn't rich, he wasn't dirt poor either. That was not where I thought it was going to go. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 16. When I was in kindergarten, I was afraid to use the bathroom as it was kind of like a disaster in there. Due to this, during recess I would go behind a big tree and take a whiz where no one would go, just outside the school perimeter. It's important to note that I grew up in a rural area and my school was surrounded by farmland and open fields. There was no fence separating the adjacent farmland, so the school had set a boundary students were not allowed to cross. The place I whizzed at was right outside this boundary, right out of sight behind a big oak tree. I did this for months, until one day I'm standing there when 2 girls come around the side of a tree out of nowhere and one of them says, "Ew, I'm telling." With that, they run to the closest teacher while I finish and quickly zip up and stand there in shock. When the teacher comes over and confronts me, I do what I did best in those days, burst out crying. I told them why I was afraid to use the bathroom, and after this, they let me go to the bathroom during nap time when no one was in there. This was fine and well until one day one of the substitute teachers walks into the bathroom and yells at me, demanding to know why I'm in the bathroom during nap time. I tell her my teacher gave me permission and she just stands there staring at me menacingly. Side note, this teacher is extremely prejudiced. I'm a shy little white boy and she's an imposing black woman. Yes, this happens IRL. Prejudice can be universal sometimes. This woman had it out for me for some weird reason, and she routinely picked on the quiet white kids that would tremble before her. She blocked my exit to the bathroom, which made me panic and I burst out crying again, to which she brought me to my class, dragging me where the actual teacher scolded her because she gave me permission. The lady just laughed her off and walked out. I have several more traumatizing experiences with this lady that I may write about in a later post. To that lady, name was Mrs. Gladys, I believe, and the 2 kids from my 32-year-old self. Seriously, you guys are messed up. Story 17. One time I was in a farmer's market with Grandpa. So backstory, my grandpa was CEO or COO of some company, so we would always have really nice strangers coming over to our house, bringing gifts and stuff to my grandpa. And there were always friends that my grandpa had around him. It wasn't until middle school when he retired that I realized they were bodyguards. So on to the main story. We were at the farmer's market and a really nice lady offered me a present if I went with her. I naturally assumed that she was one of the super nice people that my grandpa knew from work, so I went with her. Literally within 20 minutes, my grandpa had rounded up his bodyguards and surrounded the lady carrying me away. I thought it was fine, but apparently, she was taking me to sell me to the farmlands. To this day, my grandpa tells me this story every time I visit him. Mind you, this was in China in the 90s. Story 18. When I was a kid, I didn't really obey my dad that much. I didn't think he was cool. In the news, I saw a story of the smoking bandit. He would basically go to diners and bars that don't allow smoking and smoke there until they call the cops. They never caught him. I never revealed who it was, but I thought he was awesome for being a rebel. One day my dad told me he knew who it was and took me with him to a local diner where he said I could meet him if I'm good. We went to the diner with my friend and my friend's dad. My dad went to the bathroom. Then a few minutes later I hear a commotion and the guy says the smoking bandit just ran to the bathroom. My friend and his dad and I went to the bathroom to see if my dad was in there while the bandit was trying to escape. My friend's dad told me to wait outside the door to be careful. Then I heard my dad yell that he caught the bandit. He told me through the door that the smoking bandit says to respect my dad and listen to what he says. My friend's dad confirmed. Then he let the smoking bandit get away through the bathroom window. I never saw the bandit, but I respected my dad for standing up to him and then letting him go. Hate to break it to him, but things point out his dad was the actual smoking bandit. Story 19. One time I went on a camping trip with my mom and her new boyfriend, we'll call him Ponytail, in his new camper that had an enclosed side area with a bunk bed for me to sleep in. Once we got everything set up and it got dark, Ponytail starts telling me a ghost story. He tells me about this man that haunts the campgrounds. For whatever reason, the ghost likes to trick children into getting out of their beds by rocking the camper and sometimes making noise. So if I hear any noises or feel the camper moving, I need to stay in my bed and not leave my area or else the ghost will get me. Ponytail puts super amounts of emphasis on staying in my bed no matter what sounds I hear that night. I'm super freaked out because I'm already not a fan of camping, so I take this thing seriously. Sure enough, after I go to bed that night, I wake up to the camper shaking. At first, I think it's just him messing with me, then the noise starts. I quietly cover my head with my covers and just lay in bed. Fast forward to when I'm a teenager and I'm out camping with some friends. I start to tell them about this time this happened to me, and about halfway through telling the story, I realized that this whole ghost story was so Ponytail could be with my mom and prevent me from getting out of my bed to investigate what was happening. Story 20. When I was a kid, I found my dad on the bedroom floor. I called 911 and then I called my mom. An ambulance came and took him away. He was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. We weren't allowed to go visit. My mom told us it was his heart. When he came home, he gave me a bracelet he made in the hospital. I'm now 29 years old. I work at a psychiatric hospital. It never occurred to me that there were some details that didn't line up here. 2 weeks for heart issues? Can't visit? Since when does OT come to a cardio unit? I found out a few months ago my dad attempted to end it all. He was on sleeping medication. I foiled my own father's attempt and saved his life. That's some pretty messed up stuff for a child. If I'd been my dad's treatment team, I'd have hotlined him, but no one from social services ever came to talk to me. I guess things were different 20 years ago. Story 21. One time when I was a kid, I was acting out a bit. My mom was a single mom and was just diagnosed with cancer, which wound up being terminal a few years later. She did her best to take care of me, but between work and treatment, a lot of it fell to my grandparents, who were wonderful people, but I was straight up hellspawn from that age through to around my mid-teens. At one point, they sent me to a child psychologist to see if he could help me out with my anger issues. Earlier that day, I'd been playing basketball with some friends and I was a bit sweaty and smelly. The psych kept telling me about how important hygiene was and that he could show me how to clean myself correctly if I wanted him to. He'd even show me the little tricks for how to clean myself. Even at an early age, I noped out of there immediately and told my mom, who went in there and blew up on him. I'm not sure what process she went through, but his practice was definitely shut down very quickly after that incident. It was my first session too. The dude didn't even wait to build a rapport or earn my trust. He went straight to, "Let me wash you," off the bat. Story 22. Once upon a time, I was a wee little lad. My parents would often let me stroll alone around the neighborhood. One day, I heard a glorious sound emanating from the front porch of the house. I would later identify the noise to be metal. My bright-eyed ran up to the porch and asked the heavily tattooed old guy what he was listening to. He yelled and grinned. "Want to come inside and listen?" So I came inside and we listened to records for a bit. I left and he looked at me and said, "Don't tell your parents about this." Well, I wasn't planning on it. The song said some inappropriate words. So I didn't. I came back 2 or 3 times a week to listen to Metallica, Pantera, Sodom, Death Angel, and the like. One day my father followed me. He yelled at the man and dragged me home. They proceeded to repeatedly ask what I did over there. Normally I'd reply, but I was scared of them learning I listened to bad music, so I always said nothing. Didn't realize until later they thought I was getting mistreated. I was, by the raw, brutal power of metal. Story 23. Been saving this one for the right moment. When I was in 2nd grade, the Bill Clinton offense was just starting, and I kept hearing all this talk about some blue dress that she supposedly owned. I couldn't for the life of me figure out why a blue dress would have anything to do with a man who cheated on his wife. But then again, I was his child and just didn't know any better. Anyways, we had a day in class where my teacher asked us if we had any questions about current events. I raised my hand and asked her what was going on with this blue dress and why it was such a big deal. Well, needless to say, she was a bit surprised and probably not expecting that one. I remember seeing her awkwardly shift in her seat and look or sound generally uncomfortable, and her answer was really strange as well. She said, "Well, she might have worn the dress and accidentally bumped into the president in the hall, so maybe some of his DNA ended up on it." Or something to that extent. It wasn't until years later when I found out about the real reason investigators wanted the dress that it all started to make sense. Story 24. We stopped at the baseball card shop. I looked and maybe bought a pack, then our car wouldn't start, so we walked home. It was a smaller town and Google Maps says only 1.4 miles, but at an early age, I've never walked in this part of town. I sort of think my mom might have gave me money for a pack of baseball cards when she didn't have enough money for gas. Well, we had gas, but the parking lot was half a steep angle. We parked there. The fuel we did have was unable to get to the fuel pump due to the angle of the car. Still though, I was totally cool with the walk, the weather was nice, and it wasn't dark yet. Looking back, we couldn't afford $10. $10. I could misplace $100 right now, and while I'm not rich, I wouldn't really care. I remember this, and I think it's partially the reason I save so much and live cheap. I'll never be that poor. Story 25. I recall being a young girl and having an online male friend in his 30s. He found me via ICQ. I figured there was no harm in the friendship, as that time he lived in another state. The next thing I knew, he got a job in my hometown at one of the campus IT departments. He'd often ask if I wanted to go to lunch, said he'd pay, would say I could bring a friend my age, etc. Would want to talk about if I had a boyfriend, about how he didn't like any women he knew his age. Said he'd be willing to pay me to come clean his apartment or offer me money for other odd jobs so long as he could watch. Like come make a cake. I hate admitting the main reason I never took him up on meeting up was because I thought he looked creepy and old in his photos. Had a comb over like my dad. He lost interest in talking to me much anymore once he knew he was moving to another town, so he already started to accumulate new female friends my age there ahead of his arrival. Chat search engines at the time must have been great for him to have the ability to shop around for girls the age he liked, even before he moved to a new city. Ugh. Story 26. I can finally really post in one of these. So this happened when I was in primary school, and since I grew up with 3 older sisters, I was unfortunately aware of the female cycle. Not saying I knew what it was and what it was for, but I knew that occasionally my sisters randomly have it once a month. So little me thinking this was a normal occurrence for all human beings, thought that eventually, when I got older, I would do the same. So one day it happened. I actually whizzed red liquid. From what I remember, it was very painful, but I was happy because I thought I finally passed the rite of passage. I later go and gleefully tell my mom, "Mommy, I had my period." And she looked at me in a very confused and concerned way and kind of just dismissed me. She later took me to the doctor, but I thought it was just a normal checkup. Looking back at it now, my mom was probably scared because whizzing red liquid is apparently a sign of an internal wound, and she took me to the doctor because she was very worried. Well, story 27. My parents were divorcing and it was ugly. My father was cheating on my mom with a woman only a few years older than me. The two of them broke into the house one day. He had moved out and stole a bunch of things he thought was his and my mom didn't deserve. On the way out, they poked hundreds of holes in my mother's waterbed with a needle. I was in middle school and my sister was in primary school. We'd been sleeping in the bed with her as we didn't take the divorce well. We couldn't understand why suddenly the waterbed was leaking. My mom didn't tell us the truth, but instead acted like it had happened on its own. Same with the missing TV and all that. She said it was a bummer it was gone, but not to worry, we'd get another. I think back to that time and I can't believe how blind I was to what my dad was doing. Props to my mom, though, for not talking bad about him to us. Story 28. It was a long time ago when I was a kid. We lived in a very rural area, the kind that makes Mayberry look like a big city. Dad had a bottle in his garage that was labeled penetrating oil with a bolt sealing the top. Every once in a while he would take a swig off it, but always told me it was dangerous and not to touch it. When I was old enough to drive but was too young to get a license, I drove my dad's car over to a neighbor's while Dad drove their car home after he had done some work on it. They gave $5 and a bottle of clear liquid. When we got home, Dad carefully added the liquid to his penetrating oil bottle, saving a good gulp in the bottom of the jar for himself. Later that night, I heard Mom yelling at Dad about doing business with them moonshiners while I was in the car. Years later, when I told the story to my older brother and 3 sisters, they all remembered Dad's penetrating oil bottle, and only one sister knew what it was. Story 29. Maybe not as dramatic as some of the other ones, but this definitely produced several what-in-the-world moments, and it took years before it dawned on me why it was happening. When I was in primary school, there were 2 little sisters in my school who were pestered mercilessly. It seemed like half of the school was angry with them and felt justified in making their lives a misery. I'm proud to say that I refused to join in, mainly because I didn't get why these girls were being picked on. They seemed like really nice, sweet children. Also, because I was new to the school, I just assumed they must have done something bad before I joined. Years passed by, and then one day in my teens, right out of the blue, the reason got me. My school had been all white, and these girls were the only 2 black pupils. Thinking back about it, I now understood some of the chants that were used against the girls. I wanted to travel back in time and yell at all the teachers who had done nothing to protect those girls from the pestering, and also at the kids for being so mean to them. Story 30. I know, late to the party as always, but here goes. When I was a child, my mom took me to the local fair. Very small town where everyone knows everyone else. I wanted to go on a pony ride. You know, where they have about a dozen ponies tied to a metal carousel and the handler leads them around in a circle. I was anxious about getting on the ride, but my mom had bumped into someone she had spent an eternity yapping with. I felt like my world would absolutely crumble if I didn't get to ride a pony right now. Finally, she gave me the money or ticket or whatever, and off I ran. I gave my ticket to the handler and he pointed to a pony. I remember he was fat, short, covered in tattoos, with greasy hair and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Exactly what you would expect a carny to be. Now I didn't know anything at all about horses, which is exactly why I was so excited. I ran towards my pony, right up behind it. It moved its back legs out and got me. I'm laying on the ground in a daze, half unconscious. But that's not the what in the world part. I tilt my head back to look back at where the carny is standing, taking tickets, hoping someone is coming over to help me. Instead, I watch him take a ticket from a woman with a little girl. The woman was in her 20s or 30s. They walk towards me, but I'm laying in the way, so she lifts her kid up and steps over me and continues on. They were the last riders, so the carny looks at me and says, "Don't you know you're not supposed to run up behind a horse?" When I didn't answer, I was still in a daze, he said, "You getting on or what?" When I didn't answer, he gave my spot to someone else and dragged me out of the ring and left me. The father, leaning on the ring watching his kid, says to me, "If you don't move, you're gonna get stepped on." When I finally got up, my mother found me staggering around. I was too ashamed to say anything about what happened, and so she assumed I had gone on a spinning ride. "I told you that tilt-a-whirl would make you sick." I didn't tell her the truth until I was in my 20s. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.